Of all the things that we can measure about identity, the most important is the intelligence of that identity in a given cultural and natural environment. Each pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being produces a certain amount of well-being and a certain amount of suffering in a given ecological and cultural environment. And that can be measured in both the short term and the long term. And it can be measured individually and in larger and larger groups. And it can also be measured multidimensionally. We can produce financial well-being, which just means that we're making a deposit into an account. We can measure social well-being, the cohesiveness and empathy and attunement and excellence within a given group. The amount of sustainable well-being produced per unit of energy invested in an identity is the most important thing to measure, because it relates to the most fundamental of all human drives, to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse. And one step on that is the evolution, the iteration, the development of a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that facilitates more well-being per unit of time, money, and natural resources invested. But there are other things that we can measure about identity. Number one, we can look at its integration or disintegration. An integrated identity is an identity whose thoughts align with the corresponding feelings. A disintegrated identity says, I think this is a good idea, so I'm going to do this other thing instead. A disintegrated identity is filled with feeling that I want to do this, but I'm going to say this and do this instead, right? So there's divergence between the patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. So that's the integrity or integration within the identity itself. But another area to measure integrity or its lack is how one identity integrates with the identities in the other areas of life. So every identity, has a set and setting. If you go to a bar, usually there'll be some drinking involved. So you have a bar identity. Now, the bar identity doesn't integrate very well with, if you're a priest, the priest identity, i.e., you go to church every Sunday, you talk about this and that and the other, and maybe you give a talk on abstaining from excessive drunkenness for this and this reason, that this is the way forward. But if after giving a sermon, you go and have a drink to recuperate, well, there's a big divergence, right? And so this divergence can be concealed through secrecy, or it can be reintegrated. If you really want to enjoy drinking, maybe you stop being a priest that teaches other people to stop drinking, right? Or you stay a priest, but you change religion. If you're a Bacchan priest that's celebrating excessive hedonism, well, now you're moving towards integration, right? So you have the integrity or integration within the individual identity, and then you also have within a given identity, a given pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, how well does that integrate with other identities? The other thing that's important to measure is the trend. So the most important thing to measure being intelligence. Well, intelligence exists on an infinite continuum. So you can be more intelligent and becoming more intelligent, or you can be less intelligent and you can be becoming more intelligent. So you can have an identity that's here, but a year ago you had an identity that was up here, that was more intelligent. And a year before that, you had an identity up there. So if your identity, your pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, is losing its ability to generate well-being in a given context by 10, 20% per year, and you have a trend that's going down, you're becoming less and less intelligent, well, that's not very good. So the trend versus if you have a trend that's going up, that's an intelligent trend, that's a good trend. And it's worth noting that over time, the trend is more important than the position. So you might be meeting someone in this infinite continuum of intelligence who they used to be up here, then last year they're down here, and you meet them right here. Meanwhile, you used to be down here, then you were down here, and you're meeting right here. And so here you have the interaction. They're heading downward. You're heading upward. And over time, the trend is more important. In the moment, the present identity is the most important thing. So if in the moment this person has an identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, that generates significantly more well-being for themselves and others on multiple dimensions than yours, then you want to learn from that pattern. They have a superior pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is generating more well-being per unit of energy invested. But over time, in fact just 2 years, you're going to be there if you continue the current trajectory, and over time, in 2 years, they're going to be down here if you follow the trend. So the trend in intelligence is the next most important thing to measure. Now, the other things that you can measure are, for example, resilience. Some people have an identity that's very solid, and so it can encounter any number of traumatic events and stay relatively stable. Other people's identity might be the same, but incredibly fragile, meaning it's a similar identity, but the slightest thing, they wake up with a headache and their identity is lost. They no longer do the things, say the things that they normally do because they've got a headache. One of their friends comments that they don't like the way they're talking on Instagram, and so suddenly their identity collapses, right? Because they're outwardly focused, and so the identity is incredibly fragile. So is the identity coming from within? That's one distinction, versus being imposed from without. And there you have endurance or durability, longevity of the identity, because eventually the outer pressures will change. And if the only reason, for example, that someone is doing their chores is they're afraid of being punished, then when the time comes when they're no longer afraid of being punished, maybe the person who's punishing them leaves or dies, well, then the identity collapses. They're no longer doing their chores. Whereas the person that says, well, I do these chores because I have this vision for my life. I want to live in a clean house. And in order to live in a clean house, I have to do this, 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 and this. And I do this thing on Monday, and this thing on Tuesday, and this thing on Wednesday, and that's why I'm doing it. Well, then, it doesn't matter who comes and goes in one's life. The identity of doing one's chores continues after the shift because it's coming out of an internal motivation. So internal motivation, external motivation, which relates to the longevity of the identity. The intensity, both the level of discipline, in some cases the level of pain tolerance. For example, if you have an identity of every day I go for a walk, and you start to develop arthritis and you have a very low pain tolerance, well then the first time you feel a little prick, that's the end of that identity. You no longer go for walks. Now you're sitting in a chair. Whereas someone else might have a high pain tolerance and say, no, I'm going to go for walks because I want to go for walks, and I'm not going to let a little pain get in my way. And so we have the resilience or resolve behind the given identity. So these are a few of the important things to be aware of as we evaluate and iterate our identities in the direction of well-being.